The candle had burned down to nothing by the time it was over. The midwife wrapped the child in silence, set him against Cecily's chest, and stepped out of the room without a word, because there was nothing left to say and no one else to say it to. Outside, the snow was still falling. The door at the end of the hall did not open. It had not opened all night. Cecily looked down at the small, red, furious face pressed against her, and she waited one more minute, perhaps two, the way she had been waiting for 2 years, the way she always waited quietly, without making a sound, as though the very act of wanting something too loudly might make it disappear entirely. Then she stopped waiting. "Your name," she said softly to no one but the child, "will be your grandfather's. Not his, never his." The wedding took place on a Thursday in November, which Cecily would later think was exactly the right kind of day for it, gray, unremarkable, and over before anyone had time to feel anything about it. She had worn her mother's pearls. That was the only decision that had been entirely hers. Everything else, the church, the date, the guest list of 40 people who ate quietly and left early, had been arranged between her father and the Duke's solicitor over the course of 3 meetings. She had not been invited to attend. She had learned of the engagement not from her father directly but from her younger sister, who had heard it from the housemaid, who had overheard it through a door that had not been closed all the way. "You're to marry the Duke of Ashford," her sister had said, standing in the doorway of Cecily's room with wide eyes and a half-eaten biscuit. Isn't that something? It was something. Cecily had sat very still on the edge of her bed and thought about it for a long time, and what she had concluded carefully, practically, the way she approached most things, was that it did not matter very much what she felt about it, because the decision had already been made. The papers had already been drawn, and her father's debts did not care about her feelings in the slightest. So she had said, "Yes, I suppose it is," and gone back to her book. The Duke of Ashford, Callum Ashford, though no one who respected him used his Christian name, was 31 years old, owned 4 estates, and was considered by most of London society to be either very impressive or very cold, depending entirely on whether you needed something from him. Cecily had seen him exactly twice before the wedding. The first time was at a dinner at the Hargrove house, where he had sat at the opposite end of a long table and said perhaps 11 words across the entire evening, none of them to her. She had watched him the way she watched most things she didn't yet understand, quietly from a distance, without drawing attention to the fact that she was watching at all. He had good hands, she noticed, the kind that looked like they had actually done things. She did not know why she noticed that. She filed it away and thought nothing more of it. The second time was the morning of the wedding itself, in the vestibule of the church, where they had stood side by side for approximately 4 minutes while the vicar spoke to her father about something involving the register. Callum had looked straight ahead the entire time. He smelled faintly of cold air and cedar. At one point his arm had brushed hers, and he had stepped a half-inch to the left without looking at her, the way a man moves away from a piece of furniture that has been placed too close. She had thought, "This is the man I am going to marry in 10 minutes. She had thought, "He does not know a single thing about me." She had thought, very quietly, in the part of herself she did not often visit, "I wonder if he ever will." At the altar he had said the words correctly, in the right order, in a voice that gave nothing away. She had said hers the same way. The vicar had smiled at them both as though something wonderful had just happened. Outside, it had begun to rain. At the small dinner afterward, Callum had spoken mostly to her father and to his own solicitor, who had attended for reasons Cecily did not entirely understand. She had sat beside him. Of course she had sat beside him. She was his wife. She had been his wife for approximately 3 hours, and she had eaten her soup and listened to them talk about land boundaries and entailment law and the price of wool in the North Counties, and she had not said a single word that was not first spoken to her. He had asked her once whether she preferred the country to London. She had said, "I don't know yet, I haven't seen the country." He had looked at her then, properly, for perhaps the first time, and something had passed across his face that she couldn't quite name. Not warmth exactly. More like the faint surprise of a man who has picked up a book expecting one thing and found the first page said something else entirely. Then someone had spoken to him from across the table and he had turned away, and that was the end of it. The carriage ride to Ashford Park took 4 hours. They sat across from each other. Outside, the November fields were brown and flat and going dark. Callum read documents for most of the journey. Cecily watched the window and did not ask what the documents were about, because she had already learned in the span of one wedding day that he was a man who did not like to be interrupted while he was thinking, and that the silence between them was not hostile exactly, but was not warm either. It was simply empty. At some point she fell asleep against the carriage wall, and when she woke the lights of the estate were visible through the glass, a great stone house sitting in the dark like it had always been there and always would be, indifferent to the small lives that moved through it. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she straightened her spine, folded her hands in her lap and waited for the carriage to stop. She was good at waiting. She had not yet learned that waiting had a limit. The housekeeper's name was Mrs. Drummond, and she curtsied correctly, said, "Welcome to Ashford Park, Your Grace," in a voice that was perfectly pleasant, and then spent the next 3 days addressing every question Cecily asked to the wall slightly to her left. It was not rudeness exactly. It was something more precise than that, a careful, practiced form of not quite acknowledgement that Cecily recognized immediately, because she had grown up in a house where her father did the same thing to servants he had decided were temporary. Mrs. Drummond had simply decided, it seemed, that Cecily fell into that category, that she was something that had arrived and would eventually be dealt with, and until then was best managed by being politely, thoroughly ignored. Cecily noted this on the first morning, said nothing, and began to learn the house herself. Ashford Park was large in the way that old money was large, not showy, not designed to impress, but simply enormous in a manner that seemed almost accidental, as though rooms had been added over centuries not out of ambition but out of mild necessity, and no one had ever thought to stop. There were corridors that led to other corridors. There were sitting rooms that appeared to have no purpose. There was an entire east wing that smelled of disuse and old paper, and which no one mentioned and no one entered, and which Cecily therefore found deeply interesting. She walked the house in the mornings when Callum was already in his study and the staff were occupied with their own routines. She moved quietly. She had always moved quietly. It was one of her more useful qualities, and she looked at everything, and she began to understand slowly the particular texture of this place. It was a house that had belonged to men for a very long time. Not unkindly, not deliberately, but thoroughly, in the way that a room belongs to someone who has never once considered that it might belong to anyone else. The Dowager Duchess arrived on the 4th day. Callum had mentioned her once in passing on the second morning over breakfast. "My mother comes on Friday. She stays through the month." In the same tone, one might mention that the roof needed looking at. Cecily had said, "Of course," and asked nothing further. She had perhaps underestimated the situation. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford, Callum's mother, a woman named Margaret who had been formidable at 30 and had only sharpened with age, arrived in a carriage that was slightly grander than necessary, swept into the entrance hall with the confidence of a woman entering a house that was still, in all the ways that mattered, hers, and looked at Cecily for a long, unhurried moment before saying, "You're smaller than I expected. Not unkind exactly, just precise." "I'm told I take up more space than I appear to," Cecily said pleasantly. Something flickered in Margaret's eyes, too fast to name, and then she turned to speak to Mrs. Drummond, and Cecily understood in that instant exactly how the next several months were going to feel. The days settled into a pattern. Callum worked. He was always working letters, meetings, tenants, accounts, the endless machinery of a large estate run by a man who trusted no one else to run it properly. He appeared at dinner, spoke when spoken to, occasionally asked Cecily something brief and practical. Do you ride? Have you seen the East Gardens? Is your room warm enough? And then disappeared again before the conversation could become anything more than what it was. She answered him honestly every time. She did not ask him anything in return. She had decided very early that she would not chase him, not out of pride, well, not entirely out of pride, but because she had watched her mother chase her father for 20 years, and she knew exactly what that particular pursuit looked like from the outside, and she had no intention of becoming it. So she waited instead, quietly, patiently, and she learned the house. And she managed the staff, carefully, gradually, without making it look like managing, until Mrs. Drummond began, almost imperceptibly, to address her responses to Cecily's actual face rather than the wall beside it. And she read in the library in the evenings, because the library was the warmest room in the house, and also because books had never once made her feel invisible, which was more than she could say for most of the people she had met. It was in the library that it happened. 3 weeks into her marriage, on a night when the wind was doing something dramatic against the windows and the fire had burned low without her noticing, Cecily looked up from her book and found Callum standing in the doorway. He was in his shirt sleeves. He had clearly not expected anyone to be there. They looked at each other. "I didn't know you used this room," he said. "You didn't ask," she said, and then, because that had come out slightly sharper than she intended, "I come most evenings. I can find somewhere else if you—" "No," he said, and then, after a pause that lasted just long enough to be interesting, "No, stay." He crossed to the far shelf, found whatever he had come for, and then, and this was the part she replayed later, more than once in the quiet of her own room, instead of leaving, he sat down. Not close. The chair by the window a full room's width away. But he sat down. And for perhaps an hour they read in the same room without speaking, and the fire burned, and the wind continued its performance outside, and Cecily kept her eyes on her page and understood, with the particular clarity she reserved for things that mattered, that something small had just shifted. She did not know yet what to do with it, but she filed it away. The way she filed everything, carefully, quietly, without letting on that she had noticed at all. The snow came early that year. It arrived overnight without warning, the way the worst things tend to, and by morning the road to the village was gone. The road to London was worse, and Ashford Park had become, quite suddenly and completely, an island. Callum stood at the window of his study and looked at it for a long time. Then he sent word to London that he would be delayed, put down his pen, and spent the rest of the morning doing something Cecily had not yet seen him do. Nothing. She found him in the East Corridor at noon, standing in front of a portrait she had been meaning to ask about, a woman in blue, painted sometime in the last century, with an expression that suggested she had agreed to sit for the portrait but reserved the right to be annoyed about it. "Your grandmother?" Cecily asked. He turned, and for once he did not look like a man being interrupted. He looked, briefly, like a man who had forgotten he was not alone, and found that he didn't mind. "Great-aunt," he said. "She was asked to leave 2 house parties in the same season. My grandfather thought it was hilarious. My great-grandfather did not." "What did she do?" "Said what she thought." He paused. Apparently that was enough. Cecily looked at the portrait again, at the set of the woman's jaw, the faint suggestion of impatience in her eyes, and felt an unexpected rush of warmth toward a woman who had been dead for 60 years. "I like her," she said. "I thought you might," Callum said. She looked at him. He was already looking away, back at the portrait, but there was something different in the line of his shoulders, looser, somehow, than usual, and Cecily stored that away too, next to the memory of the library and the hour of silence that had not been entirely silent. She fell ill on the 3rd day of the snow. It came on fast, a heaviness behind the eyes, a fire in the throat, the specific misery of a fever that arrives in the afternoon and is fully committed by evening. She said nothing about it at dinner because she did not want to make a fuss, and then went to her room and lay down on top of the covers because it was too much effort to get under them, and thought with some detachment that she felt genuinely terrible. She did not ring for anyone. She never rang for anyone. It was a habit she had developed in her father's house, where needing things had always felt faintly embarrassing, and it had followed her here the way habits do, quietly, without asking permission. She was somewhere between sleep and waking an hour later when she heard the knock. She assumed it was the housemaid. She said, "Come in," without opening her eyes. The footsteps that crossed the room were not the housemaid's. She opened her eyes. Callum stood beside the bed, still dressed, holding a candle and looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not quite alarm, not quite concern, something sitting carefully between the two, as though he had not yet decided which one it was going to be. "Mrs. Drummond said you didn't come down for supper," he said. "I wasn't hungry." "You're ill." "I'm fine." He set the candle on the nightstand and pressed the back of his hand against her forehead, matter-of-factly, the way one checks a thing that needs checking, and the brief coolness of his hand against her skin was so unexpectedly kind that she had to look at the ceiling for a moment to collect herself. "You have a fever," he said. "I'm aware." "Why didn't you say anything at dinner?" She considered a number of answers and settled on the simplest one. "I didn't want to inconvenience anyone." Something moved across his face at that, quick and complicated, gone before she could read it properly. He left the room without another word. She thought with the fuzzy logic of fever, of course he came back in 4 minutes with a blanket, a glass of water, and Mrs. Drummond, who arrived looking slightly ruffled, as though she had been located and redirected mid-errand with some firmness. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Not for long, never with any ceremony, but he came. He sat in the chair by the window, sometimes with papers, sometimes without, and he talked to her the way people talk to someone who is ill and therefore cannot escape, more freely, with less of the careful management she had come to recognize as his default mode. He talked about the estate, about a tenant dispute in the North Field that had been running for 3 years and showed no signs of resolution, about his grey tan in the portrait and the 2 house parties and the particular courage it took, in that era, to simply say what you meant. She talked too. Carefully at first, testing the weight of each word before she put it down, the way you test ice. And then, as the fever broke and the snow continued and the days blurred together in the particular intimacy of being snowbound, less carefully. She told him about her mother's pearls, about the book she had been reading when she learned she was engaged to him, about the way she had grown up in a house where she was the quiet one, the sensible one, the one who was not her sister, and how that had shaped her into someone who watched everything and said very little and had very strong opinions she almost never voiced. "Why not?" he asked. She looked at him because no one asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm asking," he said. It was not a grand declaration. It was said simply, almost carefully, in the voice of a man who meant it without entirely knowing what he was opening. But Cecily felt it land somewhere in her chest and stay there, small and warm and terrifying, like an ember she did not know what to do with. She looked away. "Ask me something specific," she said, "and I'll answer." And he did. The snow melted on a Tuesday. She came downstairs to breakfast and found him dressed for London, his coat on, his bag already by the door, his whole manner reassembled into the shape she recognized from the beginning, composed, contained, forward-facing, already half somewhere else. "The road is clear," he said. "I've been delayed too long already." "Of course," she said. He looked at her once, just once, and for just a moment too long, and then picked up his gloves from the table. "You should rest another day," he said, The fever was bad. I'm quite recovered. Cecily, it was the first time he had used her name. She looked up. But he had already looked away, already pulling on his gloves, already becoming the Duke of Ashford again in the way that happened. She was beginning to understand, whenever something came too close. "I'll write," he said. He did not write. She had not expected him to. She went back to the library that evening and sat in her chair by the fire and picked up her book and read the same page 4 times without taking in a single word. And she thought about embers, about how they looked like nothing, felt like nothing, and could still, if you were not paying attention, set the whole house on fire. Then she turned the page and waited for spring. Spring came, and with it letters. Not from Callum, she had stopped expecting those, but from her sister, Clara, who wrote the way she did everything, quickly, enthusiastically, and with very little regard for what the recipient might actually want to know. The first 3 letters were ordinary. The 4th was not. "I probably shouldn't say anything," Clara wrote, which was how she began every sentence that she had already decided to say, "but there is talk in London, about Ashford, about a woman, a Mrs. Harlow, recently widowed, very handsome apparently, and seen twice now at the same dinner as your husband. I'm sure it's nothing. Everyone says it's nothing, but you know how everyone says things are nothing right up until they are very much something." Cecily read the letter at the breakfast table alone in the pale morning light. She set it down. She picked up her tea. She thought, "I don't know if it's true." She thought, "I don't know if it matters." She thought very quietly in the part of herself she visited less and less. Yes, it does. You know perfectly well that it does. She folded the letter, put it in her pocket, and went about her day. The thing about rumors, Cecily had learned, was that they did not arrive all at once. They arrived in pieces, a letter here, a look there, a conversation that stopped when she entered a room. They accumulated slowly, the way water accumulated in a low place, until one day you looked down and found yourself standing in something you had not seen coming. By May, she had heard the name Mrs. Harlow 4 times. From Clara, twice more. From the wife of a neighboring landowner who came for tea, and said it with the particular brightness of a woman delivering bad news. She was enjoying slightly too much. And once, this was the one that stayed with her, from Margaret. The Dowager Duchess mentioned it in passing over dinner, in a voice that was almost kind. "London is full of distractions," she said, cutting her meat with great precision. "Men of Callum's position are always sought after. One learns not to take it personally." Cecily looked at her mother-in-law across the table. "I don't take anything personally," she said. "I find it's more efficient." Margaret looked at her for a moment with that same flickering expression, the one Cecily could never quite read, and then returned to her plate. The subject did not come up again. But it sat in the room with them for the rest of the evening, quiet and enormous, like a third guest no one had invited. Callum came home in June. He arrived in the late afternoon, unannounced, and Cecily was in the garden when she heard the carriage. She had taken to spending time in the garden because it was one of the few places in the house that felt entirely hers, that Margaret had not claimed and Mrs. Drummond had not organized, and no one had any particular opinion about. And she stayed where she was for a moment, her hands in the soil, and made a decision. She would not ask. Not about London, not about the dinners, not about Mrs. Harlow, who may or may not have been handsome and who may or may not have meant something, and who Cecily had decided, firmly and finally, she was not going to become obsessed with. She would not ask because she already knew, had known since November, since the church, since the carriage ride with the documents, that Callum Ashford was a man who revealed things in his own time or not at all, and that pressing him would only drive him further back into himself, and she had too much self-respect to stand outside a closed door and knock. She wiped her hands on her apron and went inside. He found her in the library. Of course he did. It was always the library. She was reading when he appeared in the doorway in his traveling clothes still, slightly dusty, looking at her with the expression she had catalogued from the snow. Not quite something, not quite nothing, sitting carefully in between. "You're well," he said, not a question. "Quite," she said. "You?" "Yes," a pause. "The garden looks better," he said. "I've been working on the east beds. Mrs. Drummond thought it was unnecessary." "Mrs. Drummond thinks most things are unnecessary." "She's not entirely wrong." Something shifted in his face, the faint suggestion of a smile, there and gone, like light on water, and Cecily felt it in her chest the way she always felt it, that small, stubborn warmth that she could not seem to extinguish no matter how sensible she tried to be about it. She looked back at her book. He crossed to his chair, the one by the window, the one she now thought of, without meaning to, as his, and sat down. And for a while they were simply in the same room again, the way they had been in winter, and it was almost as though London had not happened, and the letters had not come, and Mrs. Harlow was a name she had never heard. Almost. She found out she was pregnant in July. She sat with it for a full day before telling anyone, walking through the house, through the garden, along the edge of the north field where the tenant dispute was apparently still ongoing. Just sitting with the weight of it, the strange doubled quality of it, the way it was both the most ordinary thing in the world and also felt, in her particular circumstances, like a door swinging open in a house she had not finished learning. She thought about the winter, about the chair by the window and the ember in her chest and the way he had said her name just once, right before he left. She thought about Clara's letters, about Mrs. Harlow. She thought about her child, this person, not yet a person who would be born into this house, into this marriage, into this particular careful silence between two people who had never quite managed to say the right things to each other. She thought, I will not let this child grow up invisible. And then she thought, with a ferocity that surprised her, I will not let myself stay invisible either. She told Callum that evening at dinner. Directly, without preamble, she had decided on directness, had practiced it in the garden. She simply said, I am expecting a child. In the winter, the physician thinks. Callum went very still. Not cold, not distant, but still, the way a man goes still when something lands that he was not prepared for, when the world rearranges itself faster than he can rearrange his face. He looked at her. And for one long, unguarded moment, she saw something in his expression that she had not seen before, something unmanaged, something that had not been filtered through the careful machinery of the Duke of Ashford, and it looked, she thought, extraordinarily like hope. Then he said, Are you well? Yes, she said. Is there anything you need? Not at the moment. Good, he nodded once, the way he nodded when closing a matter in his study. Good, and the moment closed, and she picked up her fork. And underneath the table, where he could not see, she pressed her hand flat against the linen and breathed, steadily, in and out, and told herself that hope was not the same as certainty, and that she had learned long ago not to build things on expressions that lasted less than a second. But she had seen it. She had seen it. And she filed it away, the way she filed everything, carefully, quietly, in the part of herself that still, despite everything, had not stopped paying attention. She wrote it in October, when the leaves were coming down and the light had turned the particular shade of gold that meant winter was close behind. It was not a long letter. She had written it 3 times before she arrived at the final version. The first too cold, the second too much the opposite, the third something she read back and did not recognize as herself at all. And the fourth, the one she finally sealed, was simply the truth, stated plainly in her own handwriting, without apology and without performance. The child comes soon. The physician says before Christmas. I thought you should know. That was all. She had considered saying more. She had sat with the pen in her hand for a long time, looking at those 2 sentences, thinking about everything that could follow them, about the winter and the library and the name she had heard 4 times, and the hope she had seen in his face at dinner and spent 3 months trying not to think about. And she had decided, finally, that she would not say any of it. Not because she didn't mean it, but because she had already said in the plainness of those 2 sentences everything that mattered. I am here. The child is coming. Come home. She sealed it and sent it before she could change her mind. The letter reached Callum on a Wednesday evening. He was in the middle of a dinner, 12 people, long table, the kind of evening that required full attendance and careful management, when his man brought it to him on a small silver tray with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to deliver things without disturbing the surface of a room. Callum looked at Cecily's handwriting on the outside of the letter and felt something tighten in his chest. He put it in his breast pocket. He finished the dinner. He read it afterward, alone in his study, with the fire going and the house quiet around him, and he sat with it for a long time, those 2 sentences, plain and unadorned, in her steady, unsentimental hand. And he thought about winter and a chair by a window, and the specific way she had of looking away from him right at the moment he most wanted her to look back. He thought about arriving home in June and finding her in the garden with her hands in the soil, and the way she had come inside without running toward him or away from him, had simply come inside, and he had understood in that moment that she had made some kind of decision he hadn't been given the terms of. He thought about the dinner in July, about the thing he had felt, the thing he had not been able to name quickly enough to stop it crossing his face when she said the child comes in winter. He thought, I should go. He thought, I will go, after Thursday. Thursday was a meeting he had spent 6 months arranging, 3 landowners, 2 solicitors, a question of disputed boundary lines that touched 4 separate estates including his own, and which required his presence, his signature, and his full attention for the better part of a day. Without him, the meeting could not proceed. Without the meeting, 3 years of careful negotiation collapsed entirely. He thought, after Thursday I will go. He thought, she will understand. She is practical. She knows how these things work. He thought, less comfortably, she understands everything. That is not the same as it being acceptable. He put the letter in the drawer of his desk. He told himself Thursday was only 2 days away. Thursday arrived with complications. The first solicitor was delayed by weather. The second arrived with new terms that required 3 hours of renegotiation that Callum had not budgeted for. One of the landowners, a man named Forsyth who had been a problem since the beginning and showed no sign of stopping, raised an objection in the afternoon that threatened to unravel everything, and Callum spent the better part of an hour taking it apart piece by careful piece. And by the time it was done, and the papers were signed and Forsyth had shaken his hand with the sulky compliance of a man who knows he has lost, the light outside the windows was already failing. Too late to travel. He would leave in the morning. He did not leave in the morning. There was a letter, there was always a letter, this one from his man of business in Edinburgh, requiring an immediate decision about a matter that could not wait, and Callum sat at his desk and wrote the response and told himself, this afternoon. This afternoon became evening. Evening became a second night. And somewhere in that second night, in the part of himself he did not often visit, he understood, with the particular clarity that arrives at 2 in the morning when there is no one to perform composure for, that he was not being kept in London by meetings and letters and solicitors. He was keeping himself. Because going home meant arriving, and arriving meant walking through the door, and walking through the door meant facing the specific weight of what he had not done, and what he had not said and who he had not been, and Callum Ashford, Duke of Ashford, who could negotiate a land dispute with 3 difficult men for 6 hours without losing his footing once, found that particular threshold considerably harder to cross than he had expected. He sat with that knowledge for a while. He did not like it. Then he went to bed and told himself he would leave at first light, and almost believed it. The letter he sent instead arrived at Ashford Park on a Friday. Mrs. Drummond brought it to Cecily in the morning room, where she was sitting by the window with her hands folded in her lap, and the gray November light coming through the glass. And her expression as she read it was one that Mrs. Drummond would think about later, not grief, not anger, not the collapse of a woman receiving bad news, but something quieter and in some ways worse than any of those things. The simple, unsurprised recognition of a thing she had already known. The letter said he was delayed. It said the matter was important. It said he would come as soon as he was able and that he hoped she was well and that she should not worry. It was signed, Ashford, not Callum, Ashford. Cecily read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases, set it on the table beside her, and looked out the window at the garden, at the east beds she had spent the summer working on, which were bare now and frost-edged and waiting for spring. And she thought about a woman in a blue portrait who had been asked to leave 2 house parties for saying what she thought. She thought, I have not said what I think. Not once. Not to him. She thought, I don't know if I ever will. She thought, I don't know anymore if it would change anything. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall. Small flakes, tentative, not yet committed. She watched them for a long time. Then she rang for Mrs. Drummond and asked her to have the spare room in the east wing made up, the warmest one, with the large fireplace, and to send for the physician, and to make sure there was enough wood brought in to last the week. She did not send another letter to London. She had said what she needed to say. He had made his answer. And Cecily, who had learned very early in her life that some doors do not open no matter how long you stand outside them, turned away from this one at last, quietly, without drama, without making a sound, and went to prepare for what was coming alone. It began on a Tuesday. A low, persistent ache in the early morning that Cecily noted with the same practical attention she gave most things, catalogued it, assessed it, determined it was what she had been told to expect, and then went about her day as normally as she could manage, which turned out to be not very normally at all, but she did her best. By afternoon, it was no longer something she could catalogue from a distance. By evening she had sent for the physician and the midwife and Mrs. Drummond, who arrived in that order and took up their positions with the efficiency of people who had done this before, and the house rearranged itself around her the way houses do in moments of emergency. Quietly, purposefully, all its attention converging on one room, the East Wing room, the warm one, the one she had chosen herself. It was a long night. She had known it would be. The physician had prepared her, had used words like first child, and these things take time in the careful voice of a man managing expectations. But knowing a thing and living inside it are different. And by midnight Cecily had moved well past the part of herself that was practical and calm and into something older and more animal, something that had no interest in composure and would not be reasoned with. She did not cry out more than she could help. This was not bravery exactly. It was more that she had spent so long not making a sound in this house that even now, at the outermost edge of what she had ever endured, the habit held. Mrs. Drummond, who sat beside her for the whole of it, holding her hand with a firmness that Cecily had not expected from her and would not forget, said nothing, which was exactly right, which was the only thing that could have been right, and the fire burned, and the snow fell outside the window, and the hours passed the way hours pass in the worst of things, slowly, and then all at once. At 4:15 in the morning, the child arrived. The sound he made, immediate, indignant, absolutely certain of his own presence, filled the room so completely that Cecily felt it in her bones, felt it rearrange something fundamental inside her, felt it do in 3 seconds what nothing else had managed in 2 years of careful waiting. It made her certain. Not of everything. Not of Callum, not of London, not of the letter signed Ashford sitting folded on the table in the morning room, but of this small furious person being placed against her chest, of the specific weight and warmth of him, of the way he quieted almost immediately when he heard her voice say, involuntarily without thinking, "Hello." Just that, hello, as though they had simply, finally been introduced. The midwife worked quietly. Mrs. Drummond brought water. The physician said the things physicians say when everything has gone as well as it can go, and then stepped out to give her a moment. And for a little while it was only Cecily and the child and the fire and the snow outside the window. She looked at the door. She could not have said afterward how long she looked at it. Long enough. Longer than she should have. Long enough to know, with a finality that was different from anything she had felt before, not the resigned acceptance of a woman who has lowered her expectations, but something harder and cleaner like bone, that it was not going to open, that he was not coming. That she had known, really, since Friday, since the letter signed Ashford, since the folded creases and the careful words. He hoped she was well. She should not worry. She had known the way you know things you are not yet ready to say out loud. She looked at the door for one more moment. Then she looked down at her son. "What shall we call him, Your Grace?" The midwife had reappeared in the doorway, quiet and practical, pen in hand, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman for whom this question was simply the last item on a long list. Cecily did not answer immediately. She thought about the names that had been discussed, lightly, briefly in the summer, over dinner. Callum's father's name, his grandfather's, the long line of Ashford men stretching back through the portraits in the hall, each one with the same jaw and the same careful containment and the same habit of being somewhere else when it mattered. She thought about her own father, a quiet man, an unremarkable man if she was honest, who had made unremarkable choices and lived a small, decent life and loved her in his limited way as well as he knew how. He had not been grand. He had not been powerful, but he had come to her room when she was ill. He had sat beside her. He had stayed. She looked at her son, at his dark hair, at his closed fists, at the absolute authority with which he had announced his own existence into a room that had not been ready for him. "Edmund," she said, her father's name, not his. Not the Ashford line, not the portraits in the hall, not the long, careful tradition of men who signed their letters with their title instead of their name. Edmund. The midwife wrote it down without comment. Cecily pressed her lips to the top of her son's head and breathed in the extraordinary, specific scent of him, and felt, somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the ache and the long accumulated weight of the past 2 years, something that she could only describe as arrival. Not happiness, quite. Not yet, but arrival. The sense of having come at last to the place where she actually was, not the place she had been waiting to reach, not the place she had been performing composure in, not the anteroom of some better future where Callum came through the door and said the right thing and everything resolved itself cleanly. Here, this room, this fire, this child, Edmund, hers. She slept before dawn finally with Edmund beside her and Mrs. Drummond in the chair by the fire, and when she woke the room was light and the snow outside had stopped and the world looked, as it always did after snow, briefly and improbably clean. She lay still for a moment looking at the ceiling. She thought, he will come eventually. He always does eventually. She thought, it will be different now. Everything is different now. She thought, I named the child Edmund and I would do it again. And then Edmund made a sound, small, preliminary, the sound of a person just beginning to remember that he had opinions, and Cecily turned to him, and the rest of it fell away, and there was only this. For now, only this. The door at the end of the hall did not open until Thursday, 2 days later, 2 days after. She heard the carriage in the afternoon. She was feeding Edmund, in the chair by the window, in the pale winter light. And she recognized the sound of it, had always been able to recognize the sound of his carriage, had tried more than once to stop being the kind of person who listened for it. She did not move. She heard boots in the entrance hall, voices, Mrs. Drummond's, brief and careful, footsteps on the stairs, the long corridor coming closer, and then a knock. Not the door swinging open, not the entrance of a man who considered this his house and therefore all doors in it his to open. A knock, careful, almost tentative. She had not expected that. She looked at Edmund. Edmund looked back at her with the sublime indifference of someone who has not yet learned to find anything complicated. "Come in," she said. He looked terrible. This was the first thing she noticed, not with satisfaction, not with the particular cold pleasure of a woman whose grievance has been visibly confirmed, but simply as a fact, observed and catalogued the way she catalogued everything. He had not slept. His coat was still on, as though he had come straight from the carriage without stopping, without giving himself time to compose himself in the hallway mirror the way she knew he usually did. There was something in his face that she had not seen before, not the careful management, not the composure, not the 12-people-long table version of Callum Ashford, but something stripped of all of that, something that had been traveling for 2 days and had arrived before it was ready. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. Then he looked at Edmund, and he went completely still. She did not help him. She had decided that in the minutes between hearing the carriage and hearing the knock, she would not perform ease she did not feel, would not smooth it over, would not make it simpler than it was. She had done that for 2 years. She was very tired of doing that. So she sat in her chair by the window with Edmund against her chest, and she watched Callum Ashford stand in the doorway of the room where his son had been born 2 days ago without him, and she let the silence be what it was. He was the one who had to cross it. He crossed it. Slowly, as though the floor between them required care, as though he was not entirely sure of his welcome and knew it, and this, too, she noted, the knowing. He had always known. That had never been the problem. He stopped a few feet away. Close enough that she could see his face properly now. The sleeplessness, yes, and something else beneath it. Something that had been working on him for 2 days in a carriage and before that in a study in London. Something that looked very much like a man who had finally, too late, fully understood something. He looked at Edmund for a long time. Edmund, with his characteristic indifference to the emotional complexity of the situation, was asleep. Callum started, then stopped, tried again. "He looks like you," he said. "Does he?" said Cecily, not a question. "Around the eyes." A pause. "And the way he, even asleep, he looks like he has an opinion about something." Despite everything, despite 2 days and a letter signed Ashford and a door that had not opened, Cecily felt the corner of her mouth move. She stopped it. "His name is Edmund," she said. Something crossed Callum's face at that, not quite a flinch, but adjacent to one, and she watched him absorb it, watched him understand what it meant, what it did not mean, what she had decided in the cold of a Tuesday night in a room he had not been in. He said nothing. Which was, she thought, the right response. The first right response he had given in quite some time. "Cecily," he said after a moment. "Don't," she said quietly, without heat. "I need to." "Not now," she looked at him. "He's 3 days old, I'm exhausted. Whatever you need to say to me, it will keep." He closed his mouth, nodded once. And then, and this was the thing she replayed later in the nights that followed, the thing she could not entirely account for, instead of leaving, instead of retreating to his study and his papers and the safe distance he had always maintained, he pulled the chair from beside the wall, the one Mrs. Drummond had been using, and he sat down. Not close, not presumptuous, but in the room. Present. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has run out of management, who has spent the last 48 hours dismantling, piece by piece, every defense he had and found, underneath all of it just this. A woman in a chair by a window holding his son, and the specific, irreversible fact of having not been there. She looked away first. "Ring for Mrs. Drummond if you need anything," she said. "I'm going to sleep." She shifted Edmund carefully, settled him in the cradle beside the bed, and lay down without another word. She did not tell him to leave. She did not tell him to stay. She closed her eyes and listened to the fire, and after a while she heard him shift in the chair, settling into it, the way he had settled into the library chair in winter, and she thought, not forgiven, not even close to forgiven, but here. She slept. He stayed. The days that followed had a particular, careful quality. Callum did not go back to London. He sent letters, she knew he sent letters, could hear his man arriving and departing, could see from the window the steady traffic of correspondence going out and coming back, but he stayed. In the house. In the rooms she moved through. Not underfoot, not performing presence, but simply there. He appeared at breakfast. He asked how she had slept. He asked once with the slightly awkward precision of a man consulting information he had obtained from a book, whether she needed anything specific, whether the physician had left particular instructions, whether Edmund was. "He's perfectly well," she said. "He's very loud and very certain of himself, and he's perfectly well." "Good," said Callum, and then, "he gets the certainty from you." She looked up from her plate. "The loudness as well, probably," he added, and there was something in his voice, dry, almost warm, that she recognized from the library, from the winter, from the brief bright stretch of days when the snow had kept them in the same place long enough for something to almost happen. She looked at him for a moment. "You haven't met me on a bad day," she said, something that was almost a smile. "No," he said, "I don't think I have." He met Edmund properly on the 4th day. She had not offered, and he had not asked. They were both, she recognized, circling something they did not know how to approach directly. But on the 4th morning she came into the sitting room and found Callum standing over the cradle with an expression on his face that stopped her in the doorway. He did not know she was there. That was the thing, she had caught him without the management, without the preparation, in the unguarded moment before a man remembers he is being observed. He was just looking at Edmund, who was awake and conducting his usual thorough investigation of the ceiling, and Callum's face was, she did not have a word for it. She had never seen it before. Not on him, not on anyone. It was not simply love, though it was that, it was something more specific. Something that looked like love arriving at the same moment as the full comprehension of what had almost been lost. The two things together, the warmth and the cold of it, the extraordinary and the irreversible. She stepped back. She did not want him to know she had seen it. Some things were too private to witness without permission. But she stood in the corridor for a moment, her hand against the wall, and she thought about Embers again. About the one she had been carrying since winter, the one she had spent 18 months trying to be sensible about, and she thought, it is still there. She had thought perhaps that the letter and the snow and the door that did not open had extinguished it entirely. It had not. She did not know yet what to do with that. But she knew. Margaret arrived on Friday. Cecily had been expecting her. The Dowager Duchess was not a woman who stayed away from significant events, particularly when she considered those events to fall within her jurisdiction. And she had prepared herself, the way she prepared for most difficult things, quietly, thoroughly, without letting on that she was preparing at all. Margaret came into the sitting room, looked at Edmund with the expression of a woman assessing something she intends to have opinions about, said he has the Ashford jaw, which was both inaccurate and characteristic, and then turned to Cecily with a smile that had not changed since November. Pleasant, precise, containing beneath the pleasantness something else entirely. "You must be exhausted," Margaret said. "These first weeks are so difficult. I always think it's better in these circumstances for a mother to have time to recover quietly, away from the demands of the household." Cecily looked at her. "How fortunate then," she said, "that I find the household entirely undemanding." Margaret's smile did not waver. "There is a house," she said, in the voice of someone who has been planning this sentence for some time, "in the north. Very comfortable, very private. Callum used it for his, well. It's very comfortable. I only thought, given the circumstances, that you might prefer." Margaret, Callum's voice from the doorway. Neither of them had heard him come in. He was standing very still, the way he went still when something had landed that he was not prepared for, but this time it was not hope on his face, and it was not the stripped-down exhaustion of a man arriving 2 days late. It was something considerably colder. "That's enough," he said. Margaret turned to him with the confidence of a woman who has been managing her son for 30 years and has not yet encountered a situation she could not redirect. "Callum, I heard what you only." He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice, but there was something in it, a finality, a line being drawn in a place where there had not previously been a line that Cecily had not heard before. "Cecily is the Duchess of Ashford. This is her house. You will not suggest otherwise again." The room was very quiet. Margaret looked at her son for a long moment. Then she looked at Cecily, and this time the expression was different, the flicker not gone before Cecily could read it, because this time Margaret let her read it. It was not warmth. It was not an apology. But it was, Cecily thought, the faint, reluctant recognition of one careful woman by another. Margaret inclined her head. "Of course," she said, and left the room. Cecily stood in the silence that followed and looked at the place where Margaret had been, and then she looked at Callum, who was still in the doorway, still in the particular stillness of a man who has just done something that cost him something. She thought about what he had said. "This is her house." Not my house. Not our house even, which would have been the easy version, the diplomatic version, the version that kept everyone comfortable. Her house. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. But across the sitting room in the cradle by the window, Edmund made a sound, brief, declarative, the sound of a person who has been patient long enough and has opinions about it, and Callum looked at him, and something happened in his face that was almost a smile and almost something more than that, and Cecily thought, not yet, not forgiven, not resolved, not fixed, but something is moving. Something is finally actually moving. Edmund changed everything. Not dramatically, not all at once, not in the way that stories sometimes suggest, the sudden softening, the grand realization, the moment where a man looks at his child and becomes, overnight, an entirely different person. Callum did not become a different person. He was still contained, still careful, still the man who had signed his letters Ashford and chosen a meeting over a birth, and spent 2 years looking at Cecily from across rooms without ever quite closing the distance. But Edmund changed the rooms. That was the only way Cecily could explain it to herself, in the quiet of her own thinking. Edmund changed the rooms. He made them smaller, somehow more specific, more present, and in doing so made it harder for the distance to sustain itself. You could not maintain careful management across a room that contained a person who weighed 8 pounds and had not yet learned that other people's composure deserved respect. Edmund had no interest in composure. He made this clear from the beginning, and he did not become more diplomatic about it as the weeks passed. The first time Callum held him was an accident. Cecily had not planned it, had not, in fact, been thinking about it at all. She had simply been crossing the sitting room with Edmund against her shoulder when she stumbled on the edge of the rug, not badly, not dangerously, but enough that she lurched forward, and Callum, who had been standing 3 feet away reading a letter, moved without thinking. His hands came up, and then Edmund was in them. They all three froze, Cecily, Callum, and Edmund, who stopped mid-complaint and looked up at this new person holding him with the focused, unimpressed scrutiny of someone conducting an assessment. Callum looked down at his son. His son looked up at him. The letter fell to the floor. Neither of them noticed. Cecily straightened and stepped back, and watched Callum Ashford hold his child for the first time with the expression of a man who has picked up something he did not expect to be so heavy, not heavy in weight, but heavy in the other way, the way that matters, the way that rearranges things permanently, and she thought, there it is again, that thing on his face that I don't have a word for. Callum said, then stopped. Yes, said Cecily, because she knew what he meant. She had felt it too, the first time. The way Edmund was simultaneously the most ordinary thing, a baby, just a baby. People had babies every day, and also somehow the most specifically, impossibly real thing she had ever encountered. The way holding him made everything else feel slightly theoretical by comparison. Callum stood very still, as though movement might break something. Edmund, having completed his assessment, reached up and closed his fist around Callum's finger with the absolute authority of someone who has decided a thing and sees no reason to discuss it further. Callum looked at his finger, at the small fist wrapped around it, and Cecily watched something happen in him that she thought had probably been happening for some time, quietly underneath the surface, gathering itself, and had now arrived. She looked away, gave him the privacy of it, walked to the window and looked at the garden, her east beds, bare and waiting, and listened to the fire and the quiet and the small sounds Edmund made when he was deciding whether or not to be unhappy about something. When she turned back, Callum was sitting in the chair by the window, his chair, the library chair, its twin in this room, with Edmund against his chest, one large hand spread across the baby's back, and his eyes closed. Not asleep. Just present, in a way she had not seen him be present before, without the papers and the letters and the forward momentum of a man who was always going somewhere. Just here, just this. She sat down across from him and picked up her book and did not read a single word of it for the next hour and did not pretend otherwise. December settled over the house. Callum did not go back to London. She waited for it, waited for the letter that would require his presence, the meeting that could not be managed from a distance, the particular pull of the city that had always, before, won, but December passed and then the new year and he stayed. He was in his study most mornings, yes. He worked. She did not expect him not to work, had never expected that, but the work stayed in the study now mostly, and in the evenings he appeared. In the sitting room, in the library, occasionally in the corridor outside Edmund's room at odd hours, which she discovered one night when she came to check on the baby and found the door already open and Callum inside, standing over the cradle in the dark. She had stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment. He had not heard her. "He's fine," she said quietly, so as not to wake Edmund. Callum turned. In the low light from the corridor she could not quite read his expression, but she could see that he was not embarrassed to have been found here, that whatever he had expected to feel if she caught him standing in the dark watching his son sleep, embarrassment was not it. "I know," he said, he stopped. "You don't have to explain," she said. She went to check on Edmund, who was, as she had said, fine and appeared to have opinions about the ceiling even in sleep, and then she left, and Callum stayed, and she did not ask how long he remained there. But she thought about it, walking back to her room in the dark, her hand trailing along the wall. She thought, this is what it looks like when he lets himself. She thought, the question is whether he can do it when it isn't easy. She thought, the question is whether I can trust the difference. She could not sleep one night in January and came downstairs at 2 in the morning to find the library fire still going and Callum at the desk in the corner. Not his study desk, the library desk, the smaller one by the window, with papers spread around him and a glass of something untouched at his elbow. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Edmund?" he asked. "Sleeping, I just couldn't." She gestured vaguely at the general concept of sleep. "Don't mind me." She went to her chair. The fire was warm. She pulled her wrap tighter and looked at the shelves and thought about getting a book and didn't move to get one. For a while there was only the fire and the scratch of his pen and the wind doing something minor outside. Then he said, without looking up, "I owe you an apology." She was quiet. "Several probably," he said. "But the birth, not coming, that was," he stopped, put the pen down. "There is no version of what I did that I can explain to you that would make it acceptable. I've tried. I've been trying, if I'm honest, since I got back in the carriage in London and understood, somewhere around the second hour, exactly what I had done." She looked at the fire. "I'm not asking you to forgive it," he said. "I'm not even certain I'm asking you to believe it won't happen again, because I know that's not something I can simply say. I know you would need, I know it would require." He stopped again, started again more carefully. "I know what I am. I know how the way I close things off when they I know. I've always known. I just didn't understand before what it cost." She was quiet for a long moment. "What changed?" she said. "I'm sorry." "You've always known," you said. "So what changed?" She looked at him then across the room in the firelight. "Why now? Why is this the moment you say it?" He looked at her steadily. "Because before Edmund," he said, "the cost was yours. You were the one paying it, and He stopped. She watched him choose honesty over comfort, watched him pick it up and hold it. "I let you, because it was easier than because I didn't know how to, because I was." "Afraid," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. Just that. One word. The first wholly unguarded thing she thought he had ever said to her directly, without the letter and without the management, and without the 12-people-long table version of himself standing in front of it. The fire crackled. Outside, the January wind moved through the trees. "I'm not asking you to fix it tonight," she said finally. "I'm not asking you to fix it at all, actually. I don't need a speech, Callum. I don't need the speech. I know. What I need," she stopped, tried again. "What I needed for 2 years was not a speech. It was very simple, it was just," she looked at the fire. "Just to not be alone in it," she said. "That's all. That was all it ever was." The silence after that was different from the silences before it. Not empty, not the careful management of two people avoiding something. Full, heavy. The kind of silence that meant something had been put down that had been carried for a long time, and the putting down of it had changed the weight of the room. He did not say, "I know, I'm sorry, I'll be different." He said nothing. But after a while he got up from the desk. She watched him do it, watched him cross the room without hurry and without ceremony, and he sat down in his chair by the window, not across from her, beside her. Close enough that when she turned her head she could see his face properly, and what was on it was not hope this time, and not the stripped exhaustion of a man arriving too late, but something quieter and less performed and more difficult than either of those things. Something that looked like a man beginning, not finishing, not resolving, not wrapping himself in a clean ending, just beginning. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the fire. And they sat there together in the library in January, in the specific warmth of a room that had been theirs, separately, for a long time, and was becoming slowly, carefully, with no guarantees, something else. February brought visitors. A neighbor's dinner, which they attended together for the first time, actually together. Not in the sense of arriving in the same carriage and sitting at opposite ends of a table, but together in the way that people noticed. In the way that Margaret, attending also, watched from across the room with an expression that had shifted, incrementally, from assessment to something Cecily could not yet name. At the dinner, a woman Cecily had met twice leaned close and said, with the bright eyes of someone delivering a compliment that is also a small excavation, "You seem so settled now, Lady Ashford. Marriage suits you." Cecily considered a number of responses. "I'm getting there," she said. Later in the carriage home she told Callum what she had said. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you," he asked, "getting there?" She looked at him across the darkened carriage, at his face in the passing lamplight, at the question on it which was not a small question at all. And she thought about the library in January and the chair beside hers, and the word afraid said plainly in the firelight. "Ask me something specific," she said. He looked at her. And the corner of his mouth moved, really moved this time, not the ghost of it, not the almost, and he said quietly, "Are you getting there, with me, specifically?" She held his gaze. "Yes," she said, one word. The carriage moved through the dark. Outside, the February fields were silver with frost, and ahead of them the lights of Ashford Park were visible through the glass, the great stone house, sitting in the dark the way it always had, the way it always would. But it looked different to her now. It had been looking different for some time. She had just, she thought, been waiting until she was sure enough to say so. It happened in March. Cecily did not see it coming, not because she wasn't paying attention, she was always paying attention, but because it came from a direction she had not been watching. She had been watching Callum. She had been watching Edmund. She had been watching the slow, unsteady thing building between the three of them in the rooms of this house, fragile and real and not yet named. She had not been watching Margaret. She should have been watching Margaret. It began with a letter. Not to Cecily. She found out about it afterward, pieced it together from fragments. From a conversation she was not supposed to hear, and a document she was not supposed to see, and the particular, practiced silence of a household that had been managed by the Dowager Duchess for 30 years, and had not entirely forgotten how. The letter was to Callum's solicitor in London. Margaret had written it in January, apparently 2 weeks after the dinner in the sitting room, 2 weeks after Callum had told her that's enough in the voice with the line in it, and it concerned, in the careful language of legal correspondence, a question about the terms of Cecily's marriage settlement. Specifically, the conditions under which those terms might be revisited. Specifically, whether there existed any grounds, incompatibility, failure of expectation, the particular language of contracts drawn between men who had not consulted the woman being contracted, on which the arrangement might be, if not dissolved, then substantially renegotiated. In plain language, whether Cecily could be removed. Not dramatically, not cruelly. Margaret was not a crude woman. She did not deal in cruelty. She dealt in architecture, in the careful rearrangement of circumstances until a thing became inevitable without anyone having to say it aloud. There was the house in the north, very comfortable, very private, a generous allowance. Edmund would remain at Ashford Park, of course. He was the heir. He belonged to the house, to the title, to the long line of careful men in the portraits, and Cecily would be managed. Placed, made comfortable and made distant and made, eventually, irrelevant. Callum found out on a Tuesday morning. His solicitor, a decent man, a careful man, a man who had served the Ashford family for 20 years and had developed, over those years, a finely calibrated sense of which instructions to follow and which to bring to the Duke's attention first, had written back to Margaret with a response that said, in essence, I will need to discuss this matter with His Grace before proceeding. And then he had written to Callum. Cecily did not know what the letter said exactly. She knew that Callum received it at breakfast, that he read it at the table, that she watched his face go through 3 distinct expressions in the space of 10 seconds, the first unreadable, the second not, and that he folded it, put it in his pocket, excused himself, and went to find his mother. She did not know what was said between them. The door to the morning room was closed. She sat in the library with Edmund asleep in the cradle beside her and her book open on her lap and her eyes on the page and her mind entirely elsewhere, and she listened to the house around her, the particular quality of a house holding its breath, and she waited. She was good at waiting. She had gotten considerably less patient about it. It was 40 minutes. She counted, without meaning to, in the way you count things when you are trying not to think about them. 40 minutes and then footsteps in the corridor, Callum's. She knew them by now, knew the particular rhythm of them, and then the library door opened and he came in. He looked at her. She looked at him. What happened? She said. He crossed the room, and he sat down, not in his chair, not the careful distance of the chair by the window, but on the ottoman directly in front of hers, close enough that she could see everything on his face without having to look for it, close enough that there was no managing the distance because there was no distance to manage, and he said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything. She set her book down. All right, she said, he told her. All of it, the letter to the solicitor, the house in the north, the careful architecture of what his mother had been building since January, possibly longer. He told her without softening it, without the diplomatic translation that would have made it easier to hear and would have also, she recognized, been another form of managing her. He told her the way she had once told him she was pregnant, directly, without preamble, trusting her to be capable of the truth. She sat very still and listened. When he finished, the room was quiet. Edmund slept on, indifferent. How long have you known? She said. This morning. You're certain? The solicitor wrote to me before acting. Callum paused. He is a good man. He knew I would want to know. She looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about the house in the north. Very comfortable. Very private. She thought about Edmund in the cradle, Edmund with his fist around Callum's finger, Edmund who was 3 months old and already, she thought, too certain of himself to survive being separated from his mother, though perhaps she was not entirely objective about that. She thought about 2 years of careful silence and a letter signed Ashford, and a door that did not open and a name, Edmund, chosen in the dark of a room she had not known if she would ever feel was hers. She thought, and now this. What are you going to do? She said. He looked at her steadily. What I should have done a long time ago, he said. He called the household together that afternoon. Not formally, not the lined-up staff, not the ceremony of it, but the people who mattered, the people who ran the house and would carry whatever happened next outward into the world. Mrs. Drummond, the steward, the senior footman, the housekeeper's assistant who everyone knew reported selectively to Margaret. And Margaret herself, who arrived in the drawing room with the composure of a woman who does not yet know the shape of what is coming, but intends to meet it standing. Cecily stood to one side. She had tried once in the corridor to tell Callum that he did not have to do this, that she could manage, that there were other ways, quieter ways, ways that did not require him to, and he had looked at her with an expression that stopped her mid-sentence. I know you could manage, he said. You have been managing, that is precisely the problem. She had not known what to say to that, so she had said nothing, and now she stood to one side of the drawing room and watched. He did not make a speech. She had expected, she did not know what she had expected. Something formal, perhaps. The Duke of Ashford in full, the voice he used across long tables. Something that sounded like an edict. Instead, he simply said, in the ordinary voice she had come to know best, the library voice, the 2 in the morning voice, what was true. That Cecily was the Duchess of Ashford, that this was her house, her household, her position, not contingent and not provisional and not subject to renegotiation, that any correspondence regarding the terms of her presence in this house was to be directed to him, and only to him, and that he would not be entertaining it. He looked at Margaret when he said the last part. Margaret looked back at him. The room was very quiet. I see, Margaret said. I think you do, said Callum. I think you have for some time. Another silence. Then Margaret turned not to Callum but to Cecily and looked at her with that expression again, the one she had first shown in the sitting room after the "that's enough," the one that was not warmth and not apology but was, Cecily had decided, the closest Margaret Ashford came to either. She inclined her head. A small gesture, precise, deliberate, an acknowledgement. Cecily returned it, equally small, equally precise, and thought, this is not the end of it. She is not finished, and she knows I know she is not finished. But it was something. It was a line, drawn clearly by the right person in front of the right people. It was a start. That evening Margaret came to find her. Cecily was in the garden. She went to the garden when she needed to think, had always gone to the garden. It remained the one place in this house that felt uncomplicated. And she heard Margaret's footsteps on the path and did not turn around. Margaret stood beside her for a moment, looking at the east beds. You've done well with these, she said. They'll be better in spring, said Cecily. A pause. He is not an easy man, Margaret said. No. He was not an easy boy either, if that's any consolation. Something in her voice, dry, almost affectionate, the voice of a woman who has loved a difficult person for a long time and made her peace with the difficulty. His father was the same. It runs in them. The closing off. I know, said Cecily. What I did, Margaret said carefully, was not. I want you to understand that it was not. I understand what it was, Cecily said, not unkindly but clearly. Margaret was quiet. He chose, Cecily said. That's what matters. He chose, and he chose clearly, and he chose in front of people. She paused. That's what I needed to know. And now you know. And now I know. The garden was very still around them. The last of the winter light was going, the sky above the bare trees turning the color of cold water, and somewhere inside the house, Edmund was beginning to make the sounds that meant he had opinions about the approaching evening. Margaret looked at the east beds for a moment longer. He'll need managing, she said. Still, always, he won't always get it right. I'm aware, said Cecily. You'll tell him when he doesn't. It was not a question. Yes, said Cecily, I will. Margaret nodded once. And then, without ceremony, without the grand gesture or the warm resolution that the moment might have called for in a different story, she simply walked back inside. Cecily stood in the garden alone. She looked at her east beds, at the bare soil, frost-edged, patient, waiting for the warmth that was coming whether or not you believed in it yet. And she thought about 2 years, and a letter signed Ashford, and a door that did not open, and a name chosen in the dark. She thought about a man sitting beside her in January saying afraid like it was simply a fact, like honesty had been there all along, and had only needed to be picked up. She thought about trust, about what it was made of, how long it took to build, how different it was from hope, how much harder and how much more worth it. Edmund's sounds from inside were becoming more pointed. She smiled at the garden. Then she turned and went inside to her son and did not look back. She found Callum in the corridor outside Edmund's room. He had gotten there first, apparently. She could see through the open door that he had Edmund, was holding him with the confidence now of a man who had practiced, who had learned the particular weight and particular preference of this specific small person. And Edmund had stopped his editorial commentary and was conducting his usual assessment of the ceiling with Callum's finger in his fist. She stood in the doorway. Callum looked up. He was. I heard, she said. She leaned against the doorframe and watched the two of them. Her son and this man. This complicated, careful, difficult man who had gotten so much wrong and was, with considerable effort and no guarantee of success, attempting to get something right. Cecily, he said. Yes. I know it isn't, he stopped, tried again. I know today doesn't. Callum, she said, he looked at her. I know, she said. I know what today was, and I know what it wasn't, and I know what it can't fix and what it can't promise. She looked at him steadily, across the small, warm room, with Edmund between them like a fact neither of them could argue with. I know all of that. Then, and I'm still here, she said. That's what I'm telling you. I'm still here, and I'm not leaving, and I'm not going to pretend it's simple or that I'm not still, she stopped. But I'm here. We're here. That's where we are. He looked at her for a long moment. Edmund looked at the ceiling. Ask me something, Callum said quietly. Anything, ask me and I'll answer. She thought about it, then she said, Are you going to stay? Not will you be better, not will you change, not will you promise. She knew better than to ask for promises, knew that promises made in warm rooms in March had a way of meeting cold reality and coming apart. Just, are you going to stay? He held her gaze. Yes, he said, one word. The first wholly unguarded thing she had ever asked of him directly, the truest thing he had ever said to her. She nodded once. Then she crossed the room and stood beside him and looked at their son, who had finished with the ceiling and was now looking at both of them with the focused, unsurprised expression of someone who has been waiting for this particular moment for quite some time and is prepared to reserve judgment on whether it has been worth the wait. He has your eyes, Callum said. Everyone keeps saying that. It's because it's true. Mrs. Drummond says he has your jaw. Mrs. Drummond is never wrong about anything. She would agree with you. And there it was, quiet, unhurried, in a small warm room in March with the last of the winter outside and spring somewhere close behind it. Something that was not yet happiness, but was the ground that happiness grows from. Something that had been built, slowly and imperfectly and with considerable cost, out of 2 years of silence and 1 winter of snow and a letter and a name chosen in the dark and a word said plainly in firelight. Something real, something that was theirs. It was a Thursday in May, and the East beds were extraordinary. Cecily had not planned it that way, had not stood over them 2 years ago with this specific outcome in mind, but somewhere between the frost-edged patience of that first winter and 2 full springs of quiet, stubborn work, the garden had become something she was genuinely proud of. Not loud about. Just proud of. In the private way she was proud of most things. She was on her knees in the far corner when she heard Edmund. Not crying, Edmund rarely cried anymore. He had moved past crying into something considerably more verbal. But the particular sound he made when he had been patient long enough, and had decided that someone needed to know about it. She looked up and saw him at the garden gate, 2 years old and absolutely certain of his own importance, with Callum's hand wrapped around his and his other fist full of something he had collected from the path that she probably did not want to look at too closely. "Mama," Edmund said, with the gravity of an announcement. "I see you," she said. This satisfied him. He looked up at Callum for confirmation that he had been seen, received it, and went back to his collection. Callum unlatched the gate. He sat on the bench at the edge of the beds, the one she had put there herself in the autumn, because she had decided she was allowed to put benches where she wanted them, and watched her work. He had papers with him because he always had papers, but they were sitting beside him untouched, which she noted without remarking on. Edmund made his way along the path with the focused determination of a very small person with a clear agenda, stopped at intervals to investigate things, and provided a running commentary on his findings to no one in particular. For a while no one spoke. It was not the silence of 2 people avoiding something. It had not been that kind of silence for some time. "Margaret is coming Friday," Callum said. "I know," she wrote. "She wants to take Edmund to the village." "I know that too." Cecily sat back on her heels and looked at him. "She asked me first." Something passed across his face, quiet, warm. "Did she?" "She's been asking me first for about 6 months now. I thought you should know." He looked at Edmund, who had stopped to examine something in the soil with the serious attention of a future naturalist, and the expression on his face was the one she still did not have a word for and had stopped trying to find one. Some things did not need naming. They just needed to be true. It was not a simple life. She did not think later that she would describe it that way, not to Clara, who asked with bright eyes and wanted a clean answer, not to herself in the honest accounting she kept in the quiet of her own mind. Callum was still Callum. He still closed off sometimes, still went somewhere unreachable for days at a time, still occasionally chose the wrong thing and knew it and had to be told so. And she told him, now, clearly and without softening it, and he listened in the way he had learned to listen, not easily, not without cost, but genuinely. And she was still herself, still watchful, still quiet in the ways that were habit and working on the ways that were not, still filing things away, though she had gotten considerably better at taking them back out again. They were not a great romance. They were 2 people who had come to each other sideways, in the wrong order without the benefit of having chosen it, and had made something out of that which was imperfect, honest, and entirely theirs. Edmund abandoned his investigation and made his way across the garden to her, and she opened her arms, and he climbed into them with the confidence of someone who has never once doubted his welcome, and she held him against her chest and looked over his head at Callum on the bench. He was looking back at her. Not past her, not through her, not at the middle distance where he had spent so much time in the beginning. At her. She thought about a woman in a blue portrait who had said what she thought and been asked to leave 2 house parties for it. She thought she would have liked her very much. She thought about a girl who had learned to be invisible in her father's house and had carried that habit into a marriage and had spent 2 years waiting, quietly, without making a sound, for a door to open. The door had opened, not because she had waited, because she had finally stopped. "Come here," she said to Callum. Not a question, he came. He sat beside her in the garden in the May light, with Edmund between them and the east beds in full color around them, and the house behind them solid and permanent, and, she thought, finally actually hers. And Edmund immediately transferred his collection of pathfindings into Callum's hand, with the generosity of someone bestowing a great gift. Callum looked at what was in his palm. "It's a rock," he said. "It's a good rock," Edmund said firmly. "It is," Cecily agreed. Callum closed his hand around it, and that was all. That was enough. The garden was warm, and the sky was the particular blue of a Thursday in May, and somewhere in the house, Mrs. Drummond was doing something efficient, and Margaret was arriving Friday, and the east beds were extraordinary, and none of it was simple, and all of it was real, and they were there, both of them. This time, both of them. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.